Hello and welcome to another Waypoint, where we give you Torah insights from the weekly Parsha. This week's Parsha is a pretty straightforward one, actually. We begin by learning some of the laws concerning servants in chapter 21. Chapter 21 continues to laws concerning violence, animal control, property laws. That begins in chapter 22. And ultimately, through chapter 23, we get into Sabbath law and the annual feasts. And yeah, that's kind of where it ends, right before there is to be a meeting before the Lord at the foot of the mountain. And like I said, it's it's a pretty straightforward parsha, but my compatriot has a lovely lesson prepared for us tonight concerning this parsha and some of the lessons that we can learn from these laws, even though some of them may not apply to us in a practical sense in the here and now today, especially since we aren't living in the land per se, and we're not living in a theocracy as Israel was intended to be. But all the same, there are lessons we can learn from those even still that are applicable to us today. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Seamus. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of The Waypoint, Parasha Mishpatim. Now, please forgive me, my voice might sound a little congested. I seem to be fighting off an infection today, actually for the last couple of days, but don't worry about me. I'll be fine. Thank you very much for your concern. But that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into the portion. Now, this is an interesting Torah portion. Believe it or not, this happens to be one of my more favorites. It's up there in the top 5 for me. And of all the portions, this would be, for most people, the most boring, because it's just quite literally a list of laws. In most cases, it's civil law dealing with, well, it's a little bit like reading an encyclopedia for a law firm. So for many of us, it could be boring. It could be easy to really glance over these things. But I'm going to argue that these are all intended to be something that you're supposed to look into in a much more deeper sense. Now, here on the Waypoint, we don't have the time to spend a few hours on each and every law and on every single deeper meaning that could be drawn from each law that just seems to be sort of mundane for us. So I'm only going to go over a couple with an overarching message here. So my overarching, I guess, main message here is that we should be living our lives, as most Christians or Messianic Jews or what have you, we would all agree, I think, that we should be living our lives as though the Messiah is the king of our lives, right? Now, what's a king without a people? And that should be a fairly straightforward question, but this portion is a reflection of the government or the kingship of the Messiah. So they might be mundane to us, but this is the law of the land or the law of the heavenly land when it comes to earth, we should say. In the future, when this messianic redemption ultimately happens, this will be the governing authority. This will be how our lives will look for the millennial reign. When people from all nations come to Jerusalem to learn the Torah from the Messiah, Isaiah chapter 11 and Isaiah chapter 2, there are many references in which the Messiah will be sort of the ultimate governing authority for 1,000 years and be teaching Torah to all the nations and anyone who would come to Jerusalem to hear these teachings. And so we should be living in the hope that we are citizens of another kingdom. It just hasn't happened yet, but we live our lives as though we are living in that kingdom. in order to bring that kingdom ever closer to coming down. By living our lives in an obedient manner, and by living as though we are in the kingdom, we do bring the redemption closer. In fact, that's an idea talked about. Some of you may have heard me quote before Yalkut Moshiach. It's a book, a commentary on some midrash. Particularly, this is actually commentary on midrash Shmot Rabbah, and it actually says, "Whoever does justice draws the redemption closer, as it says, preserve justice and righteousness, for my salvation is about to come." Isaiah 56:1, and that's from Yalkut Moshiach. So it's this idea that we're living for another kingdom. So yes, the laws might seem like they don't really pertain to us precisely, maybe not in this day and age, but that's really no reason to ignore them. And I think you can find a lot of interesting shadows or reflections, sort of hints to the Messiah and the Messianic era, and also some deeper, lessons to be learned from some of these mundane laws. But understand, we serve an infinite God, right? And that's a good thing. If God were big, well, then the small things would be small and the big things would be big. But luckily for us, God is infinite. So the small things and the big things are completely immaterial. It's all the same to him, really. And we know this from stuff like this, these mundane laws. God could have come down from Mount Sinai and said a couple of big things and then left the rest up to us. Like, it doesn't matter to him. But instead, he gave us an instruction book governing even some of the more smaller matters that we might seem to be things that we could just figure out for ourselves, or like, why would God care? We can handle this. This is small fries. We can do this one on our own. We'll worry about the bigger things when it comes to service of God. But no, God is an infinite being, and he cares about us in all of our big and small issues, and all of our big and small, whatever those things might be. And this Torah portion is proof of that, as he begins to show us the way our lives should look on a daily basis, and how our governments should look, and so on and so forth, from the big to the small. It doesn't matter. And he's also a very personal God, because some of these laws deal with personal stuff, things that are really between just two people, or even for just a single person. So these are more than just some arbitrary list of laws. This is actually a little bit of insight into the mind of God, of how he actually sees us as partners with him in this whole thing that we call creation, and as a very personal, close God who is infinite. So the small things and the big things are just equal to him. And that includes us as people. We think of the small person and the big person, the regular or the famous, doesn't matter. So we're told in these laws, show no partiality to the poor or to the rich. We see, again, there's this neutrality. He's infinite, so it doesn't matter. And he cares, and that matters. And he shows us that he cares here. And he's absolutely invested in our daily lives and how we do things down here. And so we see a couple of things. I just want to give a couple of examples. We see the justice system. I've given you some of that. And the ox and the donkey. This is actually an interesting piece that I was reading up over the week. In rabbinic material, the ox and the donkey, when they are seen together, it's treated as an appearance of both messiahs, both messianic figures, Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. I've talked about this in the past a couple of times, and I've already encouraged, if you are not familiar with this topic, go and watch our video, The Two Messiahs, on our YouTube channel to get a better idea of what we're talking about here. But when we get to the laws about the Sabbath, and we see the ox and the donkey also need rest on the Sabbath, and see God even cares about our animals. The ox is seen as the humble Mashiach ben Yosef, the mounted on a donkey. The donkey is the humble Messiah. I'm sorry, humbled and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Zechariah 9:9 is in connection with Mashiach ben Yosef as this sort of humble figure, a suffering servant. And then the ox and his horns, the wild ox from Deuteronomy 33:17, as Mashiach ben David, as this powerful conquering figure And so the seventh day of rest represents the millennial kingdom, the millennial era that we're looking forward to, the government that we will eventually live in. We live today as though we are living in the future government, to sort of bring it down now. And this is a reflection of that. A lot of these laws are a reflection of what it's going to be like. And so when we see the ox and the donkey resting together, what we see is the suffering servant and the conquering Messiah together resting, indicating the completion of the messianic duties that Yeshua came to fulfill and he will come to fulfill. And that is the ushering in of the future millennial reign. And so we live our lives in hope and in anticipation of that future millennial era. And we see that as an example here in Exodus 23:12 with the ox and the donkey example. And the blood transaction that we get in Exodus 24, verse 8, we see that a covenant is being sealed here in blood. I'm sure I don't need to spend too much time explaining that we also live in a kingship within a covenant that was also sealed in blood. And so we should be living our lives as though we are already living in the kingdom. As Yalkut Yosef put it, as we do that, we bring the redemption ever closer. We might live in this world, but we don't live of the world. We live, our citizenship is of another world. It is of the heavenly kingdom, and our job is to bring it here down to earth. And the only way that we can do that is to live by that governing authority as though it's already here. And then we bring that closer to actually being here, seeing that brought into fruition. And that's why the master prayed, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven." So that's kind of the main message. These might be, mundane laws to you, but I actually see a very beautiful picture of the end of the Messianic era. All of these laws, there's so much commentary on each and every individual law and how they can be linked to the Messiah or how they can better our daily lives. Believe it or not, I encourage you to look into those things. That's beyond the scope of this particular podcast episode. But I hope that your takeaway from this is that nothing in the Torah is boring. It might seem boring, and it's only because we're not able to see the full picture yet. But I encourage you to look and find the thing that is exciting, because everything in the Torah is exciting, and everything points to the Messiah and the Messianic era, and everything is a lesson for us to learn and to be gained for our daily lives as we live in the future with the hope that it will come down. May we be alive to see it. May Mashiach come speedily in our days. And with that, I will hand it back over to my compatriot, Brad. I hope this lesson has blessed you, and shalom. See you next week.
Welcome back. Seamus, thank you for that. What an incredible lesson. And it fits beautifully, actually, with the Haftarah connection that I made this week. And that's what I'm going to start calling it. It's going to be called the Haftarah connection. And, in terms of bringing heaven to earth and, the change in government, the shift in leadership, or the shift in regime, you could say, that actually is the primary thing that stood out to me in this week's Haftarah as it pertains to what we read in this week's Parsha. So in the Parsha, in Exodus 23, verses 24 through 25, this is where Hashem says, "You shall not prostrate yourself before their gods, and you shall not worship them, and you shall not follow their practices, but you shall tear them down, and you shall utterly shatter their monuments. And you shall worship the Lord your God, and he will bless your food and your drink, and will remove illness from your midst." So if we fast forward to the Haftarah, this is exactly what we see happen. Right, so 2 Kings 11:18 says, "And all the people of the land came to the temple of Baal and tore it down. Its altars and its images they smashed. And Matan, the priest of Baal, they slew before the altars. And the priests set up appointees over the house of the Lord." In this act, Jehoiada began to correct He began a correct campaign to remove idolatry and inaugurate this new king that would be. And this king, in a way, continued this campaign. What we read next in chapter 12, verse 4, is that the high places were not removed. And we could see this as a failure, but I don't see it as a failure necessarily. More a focus on what's the most important. So, what he actually continues to do throughout the Parsha is to build onto the temple and beautify the temple. He's rebuilding the temple in this capacity and making it more magnificent. Um, After having dethroned Baal, so to speak, and removed the grand temple that stood for Baal, to beautify the temple of Hashem even further, I think is a paramount focal point in that he's trying to draw attention back to the proper ways of Hashem for the people. The high places, in as much as they existed, they more or less, at least historical context speaking, would have been for more fringe cults. The main epicenter of Baal worship had been taken down, and so the king saw fit at this point to put a greater focus on restoring proper worship, rather than focusing the majority of his efforts to depleting the high places at this point. So, you know, lesser of two evils kind of situation. Take that for what you will. I think the lesson we can learn in it, though, is that the service that we render to Hashem is truly beautiful. And this is the reason why there are ceremonies that do beautify certain commandments. The commandment to distinguish Shabbat is beautified in the lighting of candles. The commandment in of itself in the Torah doesn't specify to light candles. That's something that we get from the oral tradition. But the commandment to distinguish the Shabbat, however, does exist. Now, how does one do that? There could be any number of discussions on ways that could be possible. But ultimately, candles were elected as the method of beautifying this commandment. And that is, I think, one of the crucial parts of rendering service to Hashem, is remembering exactly how beautiful a privilege it is. And I think that that's something we could all stand to take into the week. With that, I hope this week's lesson has blessed you. If you want to see more like this, definitely hit the like button and subscribe. Ring that bell for us, please. You can find us also on Patreon. We also have a website, links below. And be blessed throughout this week. Thank you.
Special thanks to this month's Patreon supporters.